So I want to start off by introducing Senator Van Hollen, who started his time in public service as a member of the Maryland State Legislature, where he became known as a tenacious advocate for everyday Marylanders and someone who was unafraid to take on powerful interests on behalf of working people. In 2002, he was elected to represent Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. He served as member of Democratic leadership and was elected by his colleagues to be the ranking member of the House Budget Committee and protect vital interests like Social Security and medical care. Senator Van Hollen is proud to have worked successfully with members of both parties to pass bipartisan legislation whenever possible on issues of common concern, including expanding medical research, protecting the Chesapeake Bay, fighting childhood cancer, and passing the ABLE Act to assist families and children with disabilities. Chris Van Hollen is a graduate of Swarthmore College, the John F. Kennedy School of Public Policy at Harvard University, and the Georgetown University Law Center, where he attended night school. He and his wife, Catherine Wilkins, are the proud parents of 3 children, Anna, Nicholas, and Alexander. So I'd like to introduce Senator Chris Van Hollen.
Well, thank you, Mia, and thank you to the entire team at Visit Baltimore and to Al Hutchinson. Thank you for your leadership as president and CEO, and to the entire group there, and all of you who are joining us today for this town hall conference. And I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. And let me just make some brief opening remarks with respect to the federal legislation. First of all, this has been a team effort, working hand in hand with Senator Cardin, and Jerome Stevens from his team is on the phone. I want to thank them. We've worked together as Team Maryland with the governor, and it's great that Liz Fitzsimmons is joining us today, and thank her for all her work. And really, at the federal level, we have been able to come together across party lines to respond to this emergency. Even in a very polarized political time, the Congress was able to pass 3 big bills in succession to respond to the current emergency. The most recent and the biggest of those bills being the CARES Act. And really, we have a 2-pronged strategy. The first is to focus on defeating the coronavirus. And of course, that means the measures all of us are taking right now with respect to social distancing. It also means making sure that our healthcare providers on the front lines get the support they need. So the CARES Act provides $100 billion to go to hospitals, to go to community health centers, to go to nursing homes and senior living facilities, to provide them with the extra help they need because of their added expenses in fighting the coronavirus. Now, a source of great frustration has been the national shortage of things like the personal protective equipment, PPE, as well as the different components for testing. And we have worked together as a state and a federal delegation to get FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to respond to many of our needs, although we have not been satisfied with what we've gotten. And so we've worked to try to get PPE from other sources as well. And that's going to be a continuing challenge for the country, especially as we move, based on healthcare experts' advice, toward some kind of reopening. It's going to be very important that we have much more rapid testing in place. So one big piece of the CARES Act has been the healthcare battle. The second piece, of course, is dealing with the economic fallout from the social distancing requirements, because we know that workers are hurting, small businesses are hurting, larger businesses are hurting, and the major focus of the CARES Act was to provide relief in that area. And I'm just going to hit some of the highlights there, and then happy to go into detail during the question period. Number one, we wanted to make sure that for people who lost their jobs as a result of the coronavirus, that we had a much more robust unemployment insurance system. And so we did 2 major things to change it. One, on top of what Marylander would have traditionally received through our unemployment insurance system, there will be another $600 per week through July 1st. Second, we expanded the UI eligibility requirements to include individual contractors, the self-employed, and gig workers. Now, I know there's a lot of frustration with the processing time of claims. This effort goes through state unemployment insurance systems, and they are very stressed because of the huge demand. But we've provided them additional federal resources, and I know that they're working through that process. I've been on the phone with Secretary Robinson, and they're continuing to work on that. In fact, today, I think, is the first day they'll begin to process the additional $600 per week checks. Another big piece of this, and Senator Cardin was very involved in this, was the establishment of emergency relief to small businesses and nonprofit entities with 500 or fewer people. And there are two major programs here. One is the PPP program. This is the Paycheck Protection Program, which is designed to provide 60 days of funds to small businesses to keep employees on payroll and to meet fixed expenses. As there's the other one is an emergency disaster loan program. The PPP program has some things we need to change in it. We're trying to change in it, and both those programs have run out of funding, and so it is imperative that we act quickly on a bipartisan basis to replenish those funds and to address some of the issues that make those programs less useful and less accessible to really small businesses. And so that is a priority right now. Third are the individual payments. I'm happy to discuss those more. Those have begun to go out electronically, but those go to every individual and at $1,200 a person, children $500 a child within the income eligibility limits. A fourth major part of this legislation is aid to state and local governments. Maryland, for example, will get $2.3 billion to provide help on additional costs. Maryland school systems, all 24 jurisdictions, will get a total of $207 million, which will help them during this time. And there are many other plus-ups in federal programs to provide relief. So those are some of the highlights of the legislation. I recognize that there's been a lot of frustration in accessing some of these programs, and we can talk more about that. But the goal, as Al Hutchinson said, is to make sure that we all weather the storm in terms of the health care battle as well as the economic challenges, that we weather the storm and then come out on the other side and really thrive as we move out of this very, very difficult period. We are all in this together. I've been proud of how Maryland has been addressing this as a state, everyone working together, and let's just keep that up. So good to be with you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to open the floor to Reverend Jerome Stevens to see if he has a few things to say.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Al Hutchinson and his team, as well as Senator Chris Van Hollen, as well as Mr. Fitzsimmons. On behalf of Senator Cardin, as you know, he is right now currently in the negotiating process for the upcoming, perhaps another stimulus package. Senator Cardin is aware of the lost revenue that has been experienced due to bookings of conventions, hotel stays, as also as it affects others like restaurants and others, especially your staff and employees. As Senator Van Hollen has outlined, the delegation is continuing to be supported as he outlined the support and concerns of the Paycheck Program, the Disaster Relief Program, also the concerns about testing and the lack of equipment. We understand that the Senator Cardin understands the industry's needs, your needs, but also looking out for the other businesses, nonprofits, even faith-based, needing assistance as well as every citizen in the state. As Senator Van Hollen mentioned, Team Maryland has been providing assistance to the states, especially Baltimore City and the schools. And we understand those lost revenues will also affect Baltimore City overall budget. But we want to also thank you for hanging in there and also to let you know that there will be better days coming and that Team Maryland is working hard on your behalf. Again, on behalf of United States Senator Ben Cardin, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Liz Fitzsimmons, who is the Managing Director of the Office of Tourism and Development for Maryland. And Liz, do you have a few things to say about where we
Sure. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to Al and Mia, and I'm humbled to be asked to speak to this group. I know it's been really difficult times. I am happy that we've always had such a great working relationship with our friends over at Visit Baltimore and with the county tourism offices across the state, and just understanding that these are really difficult times. Just to give you a brief overview of potentially some questions that you may have, is we are working with all of the industry partners through the Maryland Tourism Development Board and with the association executives and their memberships and folks that have reached out to us, and really working on how do we reopen the state. And we're looking at the National Coronavirus Roadmap to Recovery, and that is set up in 3 phases. Phase 1 is where we are right now. As everyone knows, it's the now. As a marketing organization, we are still delivering inspiration messages, continuing to engage with our consumers through social media, and just really making sure they don't forget Maryland, because we need them, we need them to come back and spend their money. Tourism is an $18.1 billion industry in the state. It's the 10th largest private sector employer. It generates $2.5 billion in sales taxes for the state and local authorities. So we really want to get that up and running, but we need to do it in a manner that is safe for our employees and our customers and our citizens. We are working towards what will be phase 2 with the lifting of restrictions. And of course, phase 3 when all restrictions are lifted. Our conversations are really centering around 3 buckets, if you will. And that is operational. How do you open back up when you're allowed to open back up, and what does that look like? And financial, the senator talked about that. There's a lot of questions about what are those programs that are available to get open and to remain viable until folks can open. And then driving demand. How do we drive demand to when we can bring people back and invite customers back? And we have a 3-prong approach for that. We are working on a campaign that says, when you're open for travel, we're open for you. Our marketing positioning statement is open, and we're going to use that platform when we start inviting customers back. And then I do want to echo what I've heard spoken about, and Secretary Scholes always says the way that we get through this is we get through this together. And I look forward to any questions that may be posed in the question and answer part of this. Thank you.
Thank you both. Now we'll go into the question and answer section. We had lots of questions that were submitted to us, and what we'll do is just ask for everyone to remute your mic if you after you speak, and to feel free to raise your hand if you have any question in the group. So the first question is locally the tax deadlines have been postponed until July 15th this year. Yet to complete the PPP application, we need to include payroll costs for the last 12 months. For self-proprietors, this figure is essentially net profit, which can only be determined after taxes have been completed. Should we complete the application now with estimated payroll costs if we don't have the exact figure?
I'm sorry, what was the question? Should they complete the application with the estimated payroll costs?
Yes.
Yeah, so the payroll provisions for determining the PPP loans, they fall into a couple of categories, actually. And what you need to do is if you're in business, and this includes sole proprietors, between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019, then the maximum PPP loan is equal to 250% of those payroll costs. In other words, right, the profits there. If it's a seasonal kind of sole proprietorship, then you look to the period between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019, or you can choose March 1st, 2019 to the time period start date. If you're not in business, if you were not in business between February 15, 2019 and June 30th, 2019, your max loan is equal to 250% of your average monthly payroll, or in this case, the profit between January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020. So I'm happy to follow up and have my team follow up with whoever asked that question or others who are interested, because it is more complicated for self-proprietors in some ways. The good news is self-proprietors are eligible for this program. Obi Chinamera on my team is on this call. Jerome Stevens, you heard from. So we're happy to work with anybody on a direct basis to try to resolve these questions as well. But there are a number of choices people have in terms of the time frame for estimating payroll, and you don't have to have it through this tax filing period, which
Thanks,
of course
Andrew.
has been extended, as was pointed out.
The next question is kind of a follow-up question. There have been quite a few people that have asked, and it is, when will the sole proprietors or self-employed individuals be able to file for unemployment? I know that might be a state level question, but there are a lot of people in the tourism industry who have not been able to apply as of today.
Yes, a very good question. And I was on the phone with Secretary Robinson a few days ago, Secretary of the Department of Labor and Licensing in Maryland, because they are processing all the uninsurance compensation claims. And they were able to start with the traditional claims. They have not yet begun processing the claims for those individuals who have not traditionally been eligible, but who we made eligible as part of the CARES Act. My understanding at this point is they need to reformat their computer systems to be able to process those claims. I understand how frustrating this all is as we try to, again, program the systems to take on individuals who have not been part of the traditional system. As many people know, they are collecting email addresses so that as soon as they're able to process those claims, they can reach out to people who have essentially signed up. Again, we have now gotten them 2 tranches of federal funds to help stand up this process. It obviously has got a huge number of people applying. So we are going to continue to work with the State Department of Labor and Licensing and on that piece. Let me just say we've also gotten questions with respect to when the additional $600 per week will become available, and we have been told that that will start today. And those additional dollars will not only be available then going forward for people who are eligible, but also go back to the beginning of the program for people who were enrolled before or eligible before the week of April 4th. And I do want to stress that I know there are big cash flow issues here, but for those who will be newly eligible, sole proprietors, independent contractors, you will also get that additional $600, and they will also receive it, backdated to the time that this new program was initiated. So people will receive those funds. I understand the huge cash flow challenge people are experiencing, which is why we're doing everything possible at the federal level to make sure that the guidelines are clear for the state.
Thank you. The next few questions are kind of a follow-up to that. Given the delays in processing unemployment claims, do you know if the payments will be retroactive to the date of the application? And for those who have already begun the process of applying for PPP funds, will they need to reapply?
So the first part related to unemployment insurance and whether they would be backdated. So the answer is yes. The answer is yes. The unemployment insurance payments will be backdated to the time of application, and back when the original bill was passed and that original start date for eligibility. So the answer there is yes. Again, that I understand there's the cash flow issues, but people will be made whole in terms of what they're eligible for. With respect to the PPP program, both the PPP program and the emergency disaster loan programs have now run out of money. Now, last week, Senator Cardin and I were both on the floor of the Senate and proposed an amendment that would replenish both these funds and also address some of the concerns that we've heard expressed from small businesses, including from the National Restaurant Association, with regard to some of the features of the PPP program. Some of the conditions that were unilaterally imposed by the Department of Treasury, but also other issues that if we make minor changes, would make the funds more usable for more small businesses. So look, this is an urgent matter, and I'm hopeful we can resolve this in very short order. Negotiations are ongoing right now, and we're trying to resolve this. I would hope, although I can't guarantee, that we will resolve this by Monday.
Thank you. The next question is also kind of a complex question here. With the PPP loan requirements, in order to have the loan forgiven, the applicant must spend the money immediately, and then 75% of it must be spent on payroll-related expenses. So for people in our industry, they'd have to bring back staff that's been laid off and put them back to work. But the industry itself is not open for business due to state of emergency and restrictions. So there's no work to do. So avoid paying the loan back, it seems that they'll have to hire staff back just to have them continue to shelter in place. But what happens after the funds run out in 8 weeks, and we're right back where we started?
Right. This is another very important question, and there are a number of issues that we need to address with respect to the PPP program, and this is why, while we re-up the funds, while we replenish funds, we should also take the opportunity to fix some of the issues here. So, two conditions were imposed unilaterally by the Department of Treasury through their regulations that were not in the bill as passed by the Congress. They capped the amount that could be spent on fixed costs. So, for example, rent or mortgage payments or utilities, they capped that at 25%, at least with respect to the forgivable portion of the loan. I've written to Secretary Mnuchin weeks ago asking that that be changed because that was not in the bill. They imposed that through regulation. They need to change that. They also made the loan repayment period 2 years when, in fact, the legislation envisioned a longer repayment period because we don't know exactly when a lot of small businesses like restaurants and those involved in the tourism industry are going to be able to get up and running. So we're trying to get those changed. And in fact, the National Restaurant Association said, yes, we want more money. We need more money, but we also need those changes. The third change, and I've also written to Secretary Mnuchin about this this week, and we're pushing for this during the negotiations that are going on right now, is that 8-week window. Because as the question indicates, it doesn't make a lot of sense to say to a small business, okay, keep all your employees on right now for the next 8 weeks, but then when the money from the PPP program runs out, what are you going to do? And obviously a lot of small businesses, especially restaurants, had to close their doors weeks ago. And the way the program's currently structured, keep your employees on for 8 weeks, then you might have to lay them off afterwards because you don't have more business, you don't have new business coming in the door because we're still practicing social distancing. So we are trying to fix exactly this issue to allow the recipient of the PPP loan to essentially pick the 60-day period in which to apply these funds for the purpose of forgiveness. There would be some deadline, of course, in which the monies had to be spent, but the deadline should be, sometime after we sort of reopen Maryland for business, and sometime when restaurants and other small businesses can expect customers to be coming in the door. So this is I'm glad this question was asked. It's it's one of the fixes that we're seeking right now as we also seek to replenish the fund.
Thank you for that. This next question is actually going to be, it was asked by several people, and it's going to be kind of a conglomerate of several questions. And so this speaks to the future of opening up for business. What should we look like with less stringent restrictions? And what will some long-term solutions be suggested as you go back into session for making sure that the industry can survive?
Well, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion as to exactly what reopening looks like. Liz Fitzsimmons mentioned the three-stage strategy, and it will obviously be different depending on the state. Right now in Maryland, by all expert accounts, we appear to still be on the upward slope of the curve, that we have not yet peaked or plateaued. So obviously, how we reopen and when we reopen depends on the advice and input of the healthcare experts. But what we do know is a key part of that will be more uniform access to testing, more universal access to testing, not just testing of people with symptoms, but doing what's called surveillance testing. So we have some indication of whether the virus is coming back in people who are asymptomatic, who carry the virus, but don't have the symptoms. So that is why access to the testing equipment on a more rapid basis is a really important part of this. We're also, of course, working to try to get a vaccine through NIH and others. But as people have heard, from Dr. Fauci, the time period for that appears to be, 12 to 18 months. before it can go testing. And for vaccines, that's actually a pretty rapid schedule. So until we get the vaccine, we need to have a staged strategy for reopening and monitoring workplaces so that if the virus is detected, people can quickly take countermeasures, and during this entire time respect some of the social distancing requirements, which even as they're lightened up will need to be applied. I've heard the analogy that I think is a good one is it's not like going from an off light to an on switch. It's more like your dimmer slowly getting a little brighter. So we're working our way through that. Obviously, the governor and the state are working their way through that. We all hope to be there as soon as possible, but it would be a mistake, of course, to open up only to have the virus come back in force. And so that's why those decisions have to be staged and done according to the healthcare experts.
Thank you. This next question is a bit of a narrative that we might have to have some follow-up on later. We're a tavern that's been a staple in Baltimore for 35 years. To restart our business and not know what that's going to look like as far as how many people will be allowed in our establishment is heartbreaking. How do we plan for this? We thought we would get the $10,000 grant within 3 days of signing up for the SBA EIDL loan. That never happened, and the amount available through the loans is now zero, even though we submitted our application within the first 3 hours of it being available. The PPP is great for many businesses, but not the restaurant or bar business, because we need working capital to help us get up and running again. We rely on cash flow to pay our creditors. Once we're open again, all of our creditors will be looking for us to repay our debts. Banks aren't offering loans, and the SBA is out of money. What do you expect us to do?
Right. So this is why the PPP program, in my view, needs to have some of these design changes, because it would be much more useful to small businesses. First of all, if we remove the 25% cap on fixed costs that can be forgiven, but also if we allow that 60-day window to be moved. And what we want is for small businesses to be able to use the PPP loan in a way that qualifies them for forgiveness, because as the question suggests, it doesn't do a small business much good if they have to borrow a lot of money. They don't have the income because they don't have any customers to help repay the loans. It just saddles them with more debt at the end of a very difficult period, which is why the loan forgiveness feature was not part of the original proposals that were made here. Senator Cardin and I and others worked hard to get that forgiveness feature because we don't want small businesses to be stuck with this debt at the end of the period of time. But we need to make sure that the conditions for forgiveness are not so unrealistic that it becomes not useful. That is exactly why, as part of this discussion to re-up the money, we want to make these changes. And I will say I've been frustrated by the unwillingness to date of the Small Business Administration and the Treasury Department to make these fixes. This is in negotiation right now with respect to the timing of the window. Now, the EIDL, the disaster loan program, was also mentioned. These loans are designed to be up to $2 million, right? The PPP loans are up to $10 million. The disaster loans are up to $2 million. Because of the shortage of funds, first those loans were, dramatically reduced to $15,000, and now, as the question indicates, because the money's run out, the whole program's not taking new subscribers, which is why we need to immediately re-up and replenish the EIDL, the Emergency Disaster Loan account as well. And that, the amendment Senator Cardin and I offered last week would have re-upped that disaster loan fund at that time. So again, I share the people's frustration on these questions, and I'm hoping they will be resolved in a satisfactory manner by Monday. But right now we passed the CARES Act by 96-0 in the United States Senate. which is obviously something that doesn't happen often in Washington these days. Trying to get consensus on each of these issues has been challenging, but these are common sense changes that are being reflected in the questions being asked, and I think we should be able to make them on a bipartisan basis. We'll see.
That's great. So we're having a couple of follow-up questions to some of what you've mentioned here. So with the changes that you're currently negotiating and discussing, will they be implemented retroactively to loans that have already been funded? And the directions have been written in a way that funds need to be used immediately. Will people be able to make changes to the loans the way they need to see fit?
So the short answer is we are pushing for any changes we made to be allowable retroactively. But as of right now, we are not getting the support we would like for these changes from the Department of Treasury, from Secretary Mnuchin or the Small Business Administration. This remains a negotiating point on whether or not we can move the 60-day window in a manner that would be much more useful to lots of people on this call or not. If we are successful at getting that 60-day window to be movable, then I would hope we would do it retroactively. I mean, I was on the phone just the other day with a small business that had to make the decision that day about whether or not to take out the loan. And we had hoped to resolve this because the best case scenario would be, okay, you get the commitment for the loan, but you have discretion as to when you start the clock ticking on your 60-day period. Obviously, it would have to be, within some reasonable time, but again, the time should be more aligned to when customers are going to be coming back in the door. Otherwise, you create this perverse incentive system where, people, a lot of people have already had to lay off employees, obviously. So that in order to qualify for forgiveness, you'd have to rehire everybody for 60 days. And then if businesses are not up and running, you have to let them all go again. Now, that doesn't make sense at all. The reason that we strengthened the unemployment insurance system was to make sure that for those employees who did lose their jobs, that they would have a much stronger safety net than otherwise. We also put in important work sharing provisions so that for small businesses that, for example, wanted to just reduce hours for their employees rather than decide who had to be laid off or who didn't, that people on work share with reduced hours can also qualify on the unemployment insurance system, and they also can qualify for the additional $600 a week. So we need to make sure these things work in tandem in a way that makes sense rather than a way where they're at odds at each other. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what Senator Cardin and I and others are trying to do in these negotiations. But again, there are some people that just say, we agree we want to get them more money in right now. We got to do that for both these programs, but we should also make these changes that make both programs more useful and stronger.
That's great. There have been a few more questions that I'm going to pull into kind of a succinct comment here. So there's a lot of talk about bailing out airlines and cruise industry, but very little about the hotel industry. The Treasury's Main Street lending program doesn't apply to 90% of the hotels and hotel owners. Therefore, it's not that helpful to us. The CARES Act also needs to clarify that the borrower is eligible even if the employees are employed by a third-party manager.
So, go ahead.
The other part to that is about predatory lenders, because during this time we know that creditors and lenders were not told to put a moratorium on collecting their debts. And so there are lenders that are not considering forbearance.
So a couple of things. First, on the issue of hotels, and restaurants. So in the legislation, and the Treasury Department did clarify this just on earlier this week, Monday or Tuesday. And I want to say, with respect to restaurants and hotels, there is a special rule for those who have more than 500 employees. So some hotels and restaurants are obviously have local franchises where the franchise is a separate entity and has under 500 people, and they qualify for the PPP loan. But in some cases, you may have a restaurant that, where the individual sites are part of the larger restaurant chain, and together the employees add up to more than 500, even though they're not more than 500 employees at any one site. So let me be really clear here. With respect to hotels and restaurants, you can have more than 500 employees and still be eligible, but not not for sites where you have more than 500 employees at one site. But if you have, 50 employees at one restaurant and 50 at another, and altogether they add up to more than 500, you do qualify for the PPP loan. Now, obviously, we got to replenish the fund and all those things, but specifically for restaurants and hotels, they are eligible even if together they have more than 500 employees, so long as they're but not for cases where they're more than 500 at one site. I hope that was helpful on that. In terms of predatory lending, look, there's a special place in hell for lenders who are taking advantage of people in this situation. I will say that with respect to with non-commercial loans, to the extent you have a federally backed home mortgage, or you have an apartment owner who has federally backed loans for that multifamily apartment, there is both a prohibition on foreclosure or eviction during this emergency period. There's also a requirement upon request for forbearance on the amounts due, first for a 60-day period, but for 2 additional 30-day periods after that. Again, it's a little complicated because the borrower needs to determine whether or not the loan comes from a federally backed lender, meaning Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, some of the HUD programs, veterans programs. Taken together, it's a fairly large share of lenders in the individual space, but there are not the same limitations in the commercial loan space. And this is an area where on the next round, we hope to address. I will say at the very beginning, a group of us wrote to the federal regulators asking them to assert their maximum authority to ensure that lenders are exercising forbearance. In the end, we were only able to craft this with the nexus to federally backed loans in these individual markets. So, but let us know, because please let us know if someone is engaging in predatory lending. Call our offices. Because most lenders have recognized that their borrowers are in a difficult position through no fault of their own, and are exercising forbearance. If you're not experiencing that, please let us know, and we can do our best to intervene, at least to urge people to exercise forbearance.
Thank you. Senator, there have been a couple of questions here about many of the hotel loans are CMBS loans, and they are subject to direct foreclosures by special servicers. And the loan servicers for those types of programs are bond secured loans. The CARES Act with a 3-month mortgage forbearance does not include the CMBS type of loan. And it would be great if the bill could also include mortgage forbearance for CMBS loans. And that way, that will keep some of our hotels from being subject to piracy.
Right. So this is exactly what I was referring to with respect to the distinction between, loans on the individual side that are backed by federally backed mortgages federally backed lenders versus on the commercial side. So yes, this is a big issue, and I hope it's addressed in the next round of legislation. Because this is a moment when people should not be engaging in any kind of predatory lending practices. The purpose, of course, of the PPP program was to ensure that there are some funds available to pay ongoing costs, whether it's mortgage or rent. But I recognize that given the huge demand for that program, many people haven't been able to access it yet. Which is why we need to both replenish it and make the changes I mentioned. But yes, this larger issue of forbearance on commercial loans, please let us know. We have written to lenders, really urging those who are not required to exercise forbearance to do so, and it would be very valuable to know of if there are lenders who are not doing that, who are trying to exploit the current situation to their benefit and harm the borrowers. So please let us know.
Okay. And then we have one final question here. So we know that in the CARES Act didn't provide much assistance for 501c6s, like many of the DMOs and the CVBs, and motor coaches were left out of this as well. Will there be resources in the fourth stimulus package that can benefit a destination marketing organization? And if so, when can we expect it to be approved?
So we've understandably been focused on small businesses, for-profit entities in this call, and we need to make sure that this whole tourism sector that Visit Baltimore works so closely with has a chance to weather the storm and get up and running as soon as possible. In addition, though, we call it that the PPP program does apply to nonprofit entities as well that have 500 or fewer employees. And the nonprofit sector in Maryland in terms of employment, is fairly significant. And so, again, the original bill did not cover any nonprofits, but the final PPP program does cover nonprofits. So that number one is, I think, is helpful, obviously, to those employers. It's true 501c6s and some of the other entities you mentioned were not included. My view is that we should be including them as well in any future legislation. After all, the goal here is to make sure that everybody can weather the storm. I mean, the goal is to allow businesses to keep on payroll as many employees as possible, but for those who are unable to keep everybody on, to have a robust unemployment insurance system. So those are the two big pieces of this. And there's no reason to have holes in that system. So, my hope would be that we would address some of those that were not included in the original bill.
Thank you. And so that actually answers many of our questions that we have here. Do you have any way that we can be most effective in helping you to do the work that you're going to do to advocate for us when you go back into session?
Well, thanks for asking, and thanks for organizing this call. I appreciate the opportunity to answer some of the questions. And I think, as we've all said, this is about Team Maryland. And so the more feedback we get from you and those who you work with respect to how programs are working, what changes can be made. That is very useful information. Then in terms of advocacy, through your different associations that people listening may be part of, whether it's the Maryland Restaurant Association or, hotel associations, obviously that information flows through to the national associations, which is why I mentioned earlier the National Restaurant Association weighing in on some of the changes to PPP that we've discussed on this phone call. So that is really the best way that everyone can be helpful, both through passing on information and feedback and suggested changes to make these things work better. I mean, the goal, again, is to make sure that everybody can get through this very difficult period. I do totally understand the frustration because some of the systems that we've had in place, throughout the country, like our unemployment insurance systems, have just not been equipped for this volume. And as I said, we're also trying to make this important change in who's eligible for unemployment insurance. I mean, until this emergency program, independent contractors, gig workers were not eligible for unemployment insurance. They're not just part of the system. We're making them part of the system for this emergency period, but that obviously involves, some growing pains in terms of getting that system up and running. PPP program, another huge program. I mean, $350 billion has already been accounted for. And so I understand the frustration in terms of the implementation through agencies. We are pushing on that front, but everybody, to the extent you can continue providing feedback and advocacy, that would be very, very helpful. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with the folks on this call. I should mention that, the state of Maryland also has, as I said at the outset, will be receiving $2.3 billion in additional federal funds. We've worked with Governor Hogan and the NGA on a bipartisan basis. We're trying to get more funds for the state and local governments so that they can also implement programs to help the state and Baltimore City and others weather the storm. I will say in the case of Baltimore City, because there are over 500,000 people in the city, they will be able to draw directly on the Treasury Department Stabilization Fund for larger jurisdictions. They will get $106 million for in relatively flexible funds, and the city school system will get $48 million to help weather the storm and develop more distance learning capabilities. So there are also other resources flowing to state and local governments that we hope to be, help make this very difficult period just a little bit easier. So thank you to Visit Baltimore for what you're doing to keep people informed. And as we've all said, we're in this together. Let's weather the storm and come out strong on the other side.
Senator Van Hollen, this is Al. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
So let me just take this opportunity, Senator Van Hollen, to thank you for participating on this call today with our members. We have about close to 120 of our members that are on this call today. So I really wanted to thank you, but not just for the call today, but for what you've always done to support the hospitality industries and support state tourism and supporting Visit Baltimore. And you and Senator Cardin have been true partners and true leaders on this initiative with COVID-19. So I wanted to just extend my thanks to you on behalf of Visit Baltimore and for our hospitality industry. As you know, we look at us as an economic engine to the state of Maryland as well as to our cities. And when you look at tax revenue and job creations that all of us do on a day-to-day basis, we're hopeful that the next package, you guys continue to push on that, and hopefully we can continue to get more relief. But I really want to thank you for your great work, Senator Cardin, great work, Obi and Jerome, thank you for what you do for the senators, and Liz, as always, thank you for the great work you do on behalf of us and on behalf of the state of Maryland. So again, this has been a great call, and you know, information is always king. So I really appreciate this communication, Senator Van Hollen, and thank you for your time. And
Well,
thank you for your partnership.
Thank you for your words. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention some of the other members of Federal Team Maryland, because Senator Cardin and I have worked closely with our delegation, including Congressman John Sarbanes and Dutch Ruppersberger, and really the whole team. So thank you, Al, and I appreciate your words and your very good work.
Yes, sir. And again, also thanks to Mia Blom and Baum Whiting from our team for really putting this call together. So I really appreciate the great work they did. And it is, as you say, Team Maryland. So we're going to go and fight this together. So again, thanks to everybody on the call.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
We have them sorted by the way.
They've unmuted. That's hysterical.
Because their IEP goal is comprehension, but
Thanks, Mia.
Then that's, we're not supposed to be.
Weekend.
Thanks, John Harris. I got